Angular is a full-fledged JavaScript front-end framework used to create single-page applications. Applications like Gmail, Upwork, Nike, and Forbes, among others, are built using Angular. Now, there's a great demand for Angular developers in the market today. So if you wish to learn Angular, then you're in the right place. But before we begin, if you haven't subscribed to our channel already, make sure to click the subscribe button and the bell icon to never miss an update. In this session, we're going to cover the topic of what is Angular. I'm sure all of you use mobile and web applications. Be it from social media to healthcare, e-commerce and net banking, these apps are used by billions of people across the globe. Now, the main reason we use these apps is that they offer seamless user experience and interface. But how are they developed to provide such reliability? One of the frameworks that is widely used to build such robust apps is Angular. So let's dive into the session now. So here is a list of topics that we're going to be covering. First up, we'll see why Angular was introduced. Then what is Angular? Features of Angular, Angular architecture, advantages and limitations of Angular, the learning curve of Angular, and finally, we'll look at some of the companies that deploy Angular. So without further delay, let's begin. Why Angular? Now, JavaScript is the most commonly used client-side scripting language. It is written into HTML documents, enabling interactions with web pages in many unique ways. So, as a relatively easy to learn language with almost pervasive support, it is exceptionally well suited to develop modern applications. But the question arises, is JavaScript ideal for developing single-page applications that require modularity, testability, and other features? Perhaps not. However, we have a variety of frameworks and libraries designed to help us with such things. With respect to front-end development, Angular and JavaScript together bring in structure and consistency to your web applications and also provide scalability and maintainability. Now, Angular is specifically developed for single-page applications. So now the question arises, what exactly is Angular? Angular is an open-source JavaScript framework written completely in TypeScript. Now, it was primarily aimed to develop single-page applications and is maintained by Google. Angular as a framework provides a few advantages while also providing a standard structure for developers. It is designed for web, desktop, and mobile platforms. Now, if you have a doubt here as to what exactly single-page applications are, let me help you with that. Now, these single-page applications are basically applications that get loaded just once. So the main page gets loaded onto your browser. So any further interactions does not lead to loading of subsequent pages. Anything that has to be done further is just an addition to the already loaded page. So these single-page applications are primarily developed using Angular. Moving ahead, let's look at the features of Angular. We have 4 features that we're going to be discussing. We have the document object model, TypeScript, data binding, and testing. Now let's look at them one by one. Now the document object model treats an XML or an HTML document as a tree structure. Now here every node in the tree structure defines an object representing a part of your document. Angular uses the regular DOM. Now let's suppose you've made 10 updates on a single HTML page. So every time you make a change, the corresponding DOM or the tree structure needs to be updated. Now Angular updates the entire tree structure of HTML tags. Moving on to our next feature, we have TypeScript. Now TypeScript defines a set of types to JavaScript, which helps you write JavaScript that is easier to understand. Now all the TypeScript code compiles down to basic JavaScript that can run smoothly on any platform. Now TypeScript is not mandatory for developing an Angular application, but it is highly recommended. The main reason it's highly recommended is that it offers better syntactic structure while making the code base easier to understand and maintain. Now TypeScript can be installed as an npm package. Now to do that, you just have to run the command npm install -g TypeScript on your command prompt. Next up is data binding. Now, data binding is a process that allows you to manipulate web page elements using the web browser. Now, it mainly employs dynamic HTML and does not require complex scripting or programming. It is used in web pages that include interactive components like calculators, tutorials, games, etc. Now, incremental display of a web page makes data binding extremely convenient when pages contain a large amount of data. When it comes to Angular, it uses two-way data binding. So any changes made in the UI element is reflected in the corresponding model state. And conversely, any changes made in the model state are reflected onto the UI state. Now, this allows the framework to connect the DOM to the model data via the controller. The last feature we're discussing is testing. Angular uses Jasmine to run its various tests. The Jasmine framework allows various functionalities to write different kinds of test cases. Karma is a task runner for the tests that use a configuration file to set the startup, reporters, and testing framework. So with that, we've covered the features of Angular. So let's go ahead and understand the architecture of Angular. Now, Angular is a full-fledged MVC framework. It provides a strong opinion on how the application should be structured and offers bidirectional data flow and updates the real DOM. MVC, short for Model View Controller, is an architectural pattern that separates the application layer into model, view, and controller. Now, model here relates to all the data-related logic. View, on the other hand, is used for UI logic of the application. And controller is the brain of the setup. Now, it is an interface between the model and view. Moving on, let's look at the advantages of Angular. First up, we have custom components. Angular allows you to build your own components that can pack functionality along with rendering logic into reusable pieces. Data binding. As discussed, Angular allows you to effortlessly move your data from your JavaScript code to the view and react to user events without having to write any code yourself. Dependency injection. Angular allows you to write modular services and have them injected wherever they are needed. This greatly improves the testability and reusability of the same. Don't worry if you can't wrap your head around these topics. We're going to discuss them further in the coming videos. Next advantage is testing. Angular has been built from the ground up with testability in mind. You can literally test every part of your application. Comprehensive. Angular is a full-fledged framework and provides out-of-the-box solutions for server communication, routing, and more. Lastly, we have excellent browser compatibility. Angular is cross-platform and browser compatible. An Angular application can typically run on all browsers, be it Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and platforms like Windows, macOS, and Linux. Now, many versions of Angular have been released ever since its inception. All of these versions have added to the efficient working of the framework. Now, here are the different versions released. First up was Angular 1. It was built on JavaScript and completely based on controllers. Next release was Angular 2. Now, this incorporated the component-based approach, wherein the entire UI was divided into several components and lastly integrated to give the final logic. Next was Angular 4. It included router updation. Angular CLI or Command Line Interface 1.0 was introduced, however not deployed. In this release, the Angular CLI was optimized and commands like ng-update and ng-add were added. In the Angular 7 release, prompts were introduced which provided tips in CLI about the functions being used. In Angular 8, Ivy Renderer and Bazel were introduced. And finally, the most recent release was Angular 9. Now this came with the better framework and Angular material. Now this completely switched to the Ivy Renderer as a default compiler. Now that we've learned about the pros of using Angular, let's look at some of the limitations of Angular. First up is a steep learning curve. Now since Angular is a complete full-fledged framework, it becomes difficult for learners to begin with. you need to be acquainted with simple topics and then move on to more advanced topics to become proficient in this language. Next up is limited SEO options. Now, Angular offers limited SEO options and poor accessibility to search engine crawlers. It's verbose and complex. Now, a common issue faced by the Angular community is the verbosity of the framework. It also poses to be complex compared to other front-end tools. And lastly, migration. Now, one of the drawbacks of Angular is poor migration. Now, it becomes difficult to port legacy code to Angular-style architecture. Also, with each new release, it is painful to upgrade and a lot of them are not backward compatible. Next up, let's look at the Angular learning curve. Now, if you wish to learn Angular, you need to be acquainted with basic topics in Angular. Some of them are directives, modules, decorators, components, services, dependency injection, pipes, and templates. Now, once you've mastered your basics, you will want to go and understand more advanced topics such as change detection, zones, AOT compilation, and rx.js. However, the learning curve of Angular is clear-cut. In the beginning, it could be a little intimidating, but once you start using the tool, it becomes way more easier to comprehend and understand what is going on. And lastly, let's look at some of the companies that use Angular today. Many top-tier companies like Nike, Forbes, Google, HBO, Sony, Upwork, among others, readily deploy Angular. So moving on, let's look at the prerequisites for Angular. First up, we have Node.js. Angular uses Node.js as its base for a large part of its build environment. So as a result, to get started with Angular, you will need to have Node.js installed on your environment. So head to their official website and download the latest release for your corresponding operating system. Next up is the Angular CLI. Now this command line interface is a tool that makes it easier to bootstrap and develop your Angular applications. Now to install the latest version, run the command npm install-g at angular/CLI. You gotta run this command on your command prompt. And finally, to confirm installation, check for its version. Now the next thing that you will need is an IDE or a text editor to type your code. Now there are several IDEs that you can choose from. But in this series, we've used VS Code throughout. So it is available on all platforms. So go ahead and download it if you haven't already. Now moving on to the final part is the demo. Now that you have a basic understanding of Angular and its prerequisites, I think you're ready to create your first Angular application. So let's head to our VS Code and begin. Here, I've created a folder called Angular on my desktop and opened it on my Visual Studio Code. So to create your app, you need to open the terminal. Just go here and select New Terminal. And now type in the command ng new and provide the name for your app. So I'm just going to say hello world. So now this is going to create, just say yes. So basically what happens is that when you run the command, it will automatically generate a skeleton application under the folder that is hello world in our case. And it includes a bunch of files and installs all the necessary dependencies for the Angular application. So this could take a while. So once you've created your application, to run it, first change the directory. So let's say cd hello world. And now use the command ng serve. Now once it's compiled, you need to go to your browser and type in localhost 4200. And once you do that, you can see your UI. You can see that the application has been loaded onto your browser and it says hello world app is running. So this is how you create your application. So let's go back to our VS Code. Now as you can see here, there are many files and folders that are created, right? So let's look at a few of them. Of course, we can't explain everything, but I'll brush through a few of them. So the first main component is basically the root component. Now the root component here is the index.html. So here, if you open the file and see, it's a very small crisp code, right? But the most important thing in the file is this app root element. So what this does is it's basically the marker for loading your application code. So this is extremely important. So the next important file is the main.ts. Now this is the part of the bootstrapping piece. Alright, so the index.html file is responsible for deciding which files are to be loaded, correct? The main.ts file, on the other hand, identifies which Angular module is to be loaded when the application starts. So this is just a brief explanation as to what they are doing. Next, we have the app folder. Now here, we have the app.module.ts file. Now this application module file can be thought of as the code configuration of your application. So here's where the source code starts from. And moving on, we have the app.component.ts. So these are all TypeScript files, hence the extension TS. Now this file basically is the root component of your application. And then we have the HTML file for the same, which defines the appearance of what you can see on your browser. So let me just change the message that is being displayed. So I'll say, hey, welcome to this Angular tutorial. So let's save this, and when we go back to our browser, we can see the message, hey, welcome to this Angular tutorial being displayed. So like this, we can make a simple change and then it gets rendered onto your browser. So this was just a brief explanation of what happens in the background of your application. First, we'll get acquainted to what exactly Angular components are. Then I'll help you create an Angular component by showing a quick demo. And lastly, we'll learn about component decorator metadata. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel if you love watching new and interesting technology videos. Also, hit the bell icon to never miss an update. So what exactly are Angular components? Now, I'm sure everybody uses web applications, and one of the most widely used applications is Gmail, correct? Now, to help you understand what components are, consider them as Lego blocks. Now, they basically are combined together to form the final application. So in this case, here we have the logo component, then you have a sign-in component, an image component, and then a create account component. Now, all of these components generally don't affect the working of each other. But however, when embedded, they define the UI of your application. So I hope you understood what components are. So to go ahead, let's discuss some of its common features. Now, firstly, they are the building blocks of an application. Generally, you have a root component, which is basically the app component, and then it branches out into other components, creating a hierarchy. And these components are a subset of directives. Now, don't worry about what directives are because we'll cover them later on in the series. But to give you an idea, there are three types of directives. You have the structural directives, the attribute directives, and the component directives. Only one component can be instantiated per element in a template. Now, components are typically custom HTML elements, and each of these elements can instantiate only one component. Now, don't worry, you'll understand this better when I show you the demo. Nextly, a TypeScript class is used to create a component. Now, this class is then decorated with the @component decorator. Now, the decorator accepts a metadata object that gives information about the component. Now, a component must belong to the ng module in order for it to be usable by another component or application. And finally, components control their runtime behavior by implementing lifecycle hooks. So this was just a brief introduction to what Angular components are. Now, you will only be able to understand the working of components when I show it to you practically. So let's head over to our Visual Studio Code. Now here, back in my VS Code, I've created a folder called Angular Demo, within which I've created an Angular application called Demo Components. Once executed, the browser looks something like this. So if you haven't watched our previous video on getting started with Angular, that is Angular Hello World, I highly suggest you go through that video first. It helps you create your first Angular application. So now let's go ahead and create our first component. Now the command used to create our component is ng gc and your component name. Once executed, it creates 4 different files. Now let's just see how this works on our VS Code. Now what you can do is head to your terminal and type in the command ng gc and provide a name for your component. For example, I'm going to just call my component text component. Alright. So what it does is that it creates 4 different files. You can see you have 4 different files that have been created, and finally it updates the file that is app.module.ts, indicating that this new component has been created. So here in your source folder, within which there's an app folder, and again here you can see that your 4 different files have been created. First is the HTML file, wherein you can define all the code that you want for your component. Next you have the CSS file for your styling. Then you have the .ts file, which includes the component decorator. And finally you have spec.ts, which is basically a unit test file. Alright, and then in your app.module.ts, you can observe that the component that you've created, that is text component, has been imported. That is what the message conveys here. Alright, now let's go back to our app.component.html. Now this basically has all the code for your application, so let me just get rid of it. And I'm just gonna display a basic heading saying hello, welcome. Alright, so let me save it. And if you go ahead and look at your browser, hello, welcome message is displayed. Now let's go back to our component.html file. And here, let me provide a message. Let me say H3, and let me display a message saying welcome to this tutorial on Angular components. Alright, now in your text component.ts file, which is your TypeScript file, the selector mentioned here is app-text component. Now go ahead and copy this, and in your final component.html, go ahead and create your custom HTML tag with the selector that you just copied. Now this indicates that the component that you just created, that is the text component, is being incorporated in the final render. So what happens is that whatever is defined in the component.html file is also being rendered in your final output. So when I save this, let's go ahead and check our browser. You can see that the message welcome to this tutorial on Angular components is displayed. So this was a simple creation of a component. Now for this, let's give it some styling. So here, go to your .css file and provide some styling. Say for example here, I just say text align. And let me say center. And also in my app.component.cs, I'm going to give the same thing. I'll say h1, text align is center. Alright, so let me save this, and there we go. Now we can also create multiple components and define the tags in the app component. Now the components are executed sequentially. So now let's create another component just to give you a brief insight into it. Let's say ng-gc image component. Now here I'm going to be adding the Simplilearn logo. So I'll show you how that works. Now you can see that a new component has been created with 4 files again. So in my assets folder here, I've added the logo. So what I can do is back in my HTML file, I can go ahead and create an image tag. So first, let me just display another message here just to avoid any confusion. And let me say this is the image component. And then let me say image source equals, so the source is basically assets / logo.png and class equals center. Alright, so you can also head to your CSS file and provide any sort of styling that you need. So let me just say text align to be center, and then let's create a styling for the image, and here I mentioned the code for the image. So let's save this, and from the .cs file, let's copy the selector and create a custom HTML tag in our final component.html file. So there we go. Let's save this and check the output. And there we go. First, the hello welcome message is displayed. Next, you have the message displayed from the first component, and then you have the second component. So this is how you can create your own components, and don't forget to incorporate these selectors into your final HTML file. So moving on to our next topic, component decorator metadata. Now, as mentioned earlier, the @component decorator accepts a metadata object that provides information about the component. Correct? Here is a list of properties of the metadata object. First up is the selector. Now, basically, the selector is a CSS selector that identifies this particular component in a template. Now, this corresponds to the HTML tag that is included in the parent component. You can create your own HTML tag. However, the same has to be included in the parent component. So to help you understand that better, let's head back to our VS Code and say, for example, in our text component here, the selector says text component, correct? For the time being, let's change it to say n component. All right. Now, when you save it and look at the browser, the message is not displayed. So what we can do is you can copy this selector and then include this here. And now you can see that the same component has been rendered onto your output. All right. So the selector plays a crucial role in that. Next up, we have the template. Now, a template is an inline defined template for the view. Now, the template can be used to provide some particular markup. The markup could typically include some headings or paragraphs that are displayed on the UI. Next up, we have template URL. Now, it is the URL for the external file containing the template for the view. So here you can see, this is basically the external file that contains the template for the view. Next up, you have styles. Now, these are also inline defined styles that can be applied to the components view. So any code that you provide in the .css file can also be included here. Next, you have the style URLs. Now, this is a list of URLs to your style sheets that are applied on your components view. Next up, you have providers. Now, this is again an array where certain services can be registered for your component. Lastly, we have animations. As the name suggests, these are animations that can be listed for your components. In today's session, we're going to learn all about Angular data binding. But before we begin, if you haven't subscribed to our channel already, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to never miss an update. So now, without further ado, let's begin. So here's what's in store for you. First, we'll understand what exactly data binding is. Next, we'll understand the types of data binding, that is interpolation and property binding, event binding, and two-way data binding. So let's begin. What exactly is data binding? Now, I'm sure you must have heard the term data binding quite often. Now, data binding is what is responsible to ensure consistency between the view and your component. So it allows an internet user to manipulate all the web page elements in the web browser. And it employs dynamic HTML and does not require any sort of complex scripting or programming. It is generally used for web pages that contain interactive components like calculators, tutorials, and games. And lastly, it ensures incremental display of a web page. Now, in simple terms, what I'm saying is that data binding ensures that any change made in the UI of the application is also reflected in the component and vice versa. By doing so, data binding ensures consistency throughout the application. So now let's have a look at the different types of data binding. First up, we're going to be learning about interpolation and property binding. Next, event binding, and then the two-way data binding. So what exactly is interpolation and property data binding? Now when it comes to interpolation binding, it ensures that the values are reflected from the components to the DOM. In this technique, text representing variables and components are placed between double curly braces in the template. So Angular finds the variable matching the text in the component and replaces the text with the actual value assigned to that particular variable. So this could be numbers, strings, etc. So to understand this better, let's look at a simple demo. Back in my VS Code, I've created a simple Angular project and then created a folder called binding. Alright, and I've displayed the message welcome on the screen here. So now in my component.ts file, I'll create a variable. Let's call it name. Say public name equals, and I'm going to assign the value Simplilearn to it. Alright, and here in my HTML, for interpolation, what I'm going to do is, as mentioned earlier, I'll have to include the variable name within curly braces, right? So I'll say welcome to, and within curly braces, I'm just going to say name. Alright, and to just beautify the code, I'll just center align everything. I'll just say style. Now here in the browser, we can see welcome to Simplilearn being displayed. As you can see, this part is being replaced by the value of the variable name, which is Simplilearn. Alright, we can also add another one. Let's just create another variable and saying public. I'm going to say topic and let me say data binding. Alright, and in my HTML file, I'll create and I'm going to display another message saying welcome to the topic tutorial. So topic here must be replaced by its value. Alright, so let's see that. So let me just save this and have a look at the browser. So here you can see that welcome to the data binding tutorial is being displayed. So this is a simple example of interpolation binding. So now moving on to property binding. Now again, property binding is a one-way mechanism that lets you set the property of a view element. Now it involves updating the value of a property in the component and binding it to an element in the view template. And property binding uses the square braces syntax for data binding. So now let's have a look at the simple demo. So now I'm going to be creating an image variable and I'm going to provide the path to my logo.png in my assets folder. So let me just say /assets/logo.png. Alright, and now back in my HTML file, I will create a simple image tag, image, and then I'm going to use property binding for the source property, and source equals image. Alright, and now just to beautify the code, I'm just going to provide some styling. With some height and width. And I've also provided the CSS styling for center. So now once you save the file and have a look at the browser, you can see that the image is being displayed with the help of property data binding. Now you could argue that instead of using property binding, you could have just used interpolation binding. Now, however, there is one drawback using interpolation binding. Interpolation binding can only be used for string values. When you want to bind Boolean values, property binding is a better option. Next up, we have event binding. So this data binding type is used when information flows from the view to the component when an event is triggered. So what happens is that the view sends the data from an event like the click of a button to be used to update the component. It is the exact opposite of property binding, where the data goes from the component to the view. So again, the event could be a mouse click or a key press. So now let's head to VS Code. So here I'm going to be creating a button for the click event. Alright, so let's just create a button. Okay, and I'm going to display the message subscribe to Simplilearn on it. Alright, and the event is going to be a click event. So let me say click, and I'm going to pass a function called onClick. Alright, so what happens is that when the button is clicked, this particular method is called. So now let's define the method in our component.ts file. So here I'll say onClick. I'm going to just display a console message saying thank you for subscribing. Okay. So what happens is that I'm binding the click event to the onClick method, and every time the user clicks on this button, the message is displayed. So now let's have a look at the browser. Let's just inspect this first. Alright, in my console. Now when I click on the button, you can see the message thank you for subscribing is displayed. So this is how event binding is achieved. And lastly, let's have a look at two-way data binding. Now, two-way data binding is a mechanism where data flows from the component to the view and back. The component and view are always in sync, and the changes made on either ends will immediately update both ways. Now, two-way data binding is typically used when dealing with forms where the user input is used to update the component's state and vice versa. So let's have a look at the demo. Let me just center align this. First, let's say div style okay. Alright, so first I'm going to be creating a property, and let's just call it public value, and I'm going to just initialize it to nothing. Alright, and back in my HTML, I'm going to create an input tag of type text, and I'm going to bind the value using interpolation. Alright, so basically what we're doing is that every time the user provides a value in the input box, that has to be reflected in the model as well. So we're making sure that the view and the model are in sync. And to make sure this happens, we have to make use of the ng model directive. So for that, I'm just going to provide ng model. Now, one thing to remember is that we'll have to make use of banana in a box styling for it. So first, I'm going to make use of parentheses and then square brackets. And this needs to be initialized to value. Alright, so let's save this. So in the browser, when I provide a text in my input box, you can see that nothing below is being displayed. Whatever in the text box, whatever I provide in the text box needs to be displayed. But although we've used the ng model directive here, it still does not display the message. That is because ng model directive is a part of the forms module. So you'll have to go ahead and import that in your module.ts file. So here just say import forms module from Angular forms, and just provide it in your imports array. Say forms module. Save this. Alright, and now let's have a look at the browser. So when I provide anything, the same is being displayed down, which means that our model and our view are in complete sync. This is how two-way data binding is achieved. First, we'll have a look at what's in store for us. First, we'll understand what exactly dependency injection is. Then we'll understand the demerit or the drawback of not using dependency injection. Then we'll understand dependency injection as a design pattern. And finally, I'll help you understand the entire concept with the help of a demo. So let's begin. What exactly is dependency injection? So let's consider this. I'm sure you're aware that Angular uses the concept of components. The entire UI of the application is divided into several components. Now, what if all of these components perform similar tasks, be it accessing the database, rendering images, etc.? Now, instead of writing the same piece of code for every component, you could write the code once and then perhaps inject the same code into every component. Now, this is supported by dependency injection. Now, to give you a better example, consider two classes A and B. Now, let's assume that A uses the objects of class B, and normally in object-oriented programming, an instance of class B is created so that A can access its objects. But using dependency injection, we move the creation and binding of dependent objects outside of the class that depend on them. So dependency injection or DI keeps the code more flexible, testable, and mutable. Also, classes can inherit external logic without having to create on its own. And lastly, DI benefits directives, pipes, and components. Next up, let's have a look at the drawback of not using dependency injection. Now let's consider class postal details that is dependent on the number and the address class. In the postal details class, the constructor creates copies of the number and address. So when you instantiate a new postal details class, the constructor instantiates a unique number and address. Now, although this looks simple, there's a problem with this code. Let's assume that the number and address class constructors now accept parameters. When we change the numbers class, the postal details class gets broken. Now, to overcome this, what we need to do is we need to pass parameter to the number constructor. So this applies to address as well. The first drawback of using this traditional method is that the code is not very flexible. Anytime the dependencies change, the postal details class needs to be changed as well. And the second drawback is that the code is not suitable for testing. Once you instantiate the new postal details class, you get the same number and address. Even if you change the number and address classes every time, what if these classes are in turn dependent on other classes? Then it's going to be a chain reaction. So to overcome this, we make use of dependency injection. Now let's look at DI as a pattern. Dependency injection, as you all know, is a coding pattern where a class receives its dependencies from an external source rather than creating them on its own. So here in the above example, we have moved the definition of dependencies from inside the constructor to the constructor's parameters. So the postal details class doesn't create the dependencies anymore. It just consumes them. So the postal dependencies class doesn't create the dependencies anymore. So with that, we overcome the drawbacks of not using DI. So now that you know what exactly dependency injection is and how vital it is, let's look at a simple demonstration to understand the concept better. Now, services, classes, modules, components, all of these are benefactors of dependency injection. So in the demo, I'm going to be showing how dependency injection can be used with the help of services and injecting these services into classes. So the main thought behind this is normally components are used to ensure just a good user experience. These components do not generally execute tasks. So to execute these tasks, we make use of services. So a component can delegate tasks like fetching data from the server, any network related issues, etc. to a particular service. And these services can be made available to components. With the same thought, what I'm going to be doing is I'll be creating a service that performs the task of displaying an employee list. Later, we're going to inject this service into the class using dependency injection. So let's head to our Visual Studio Code for the demonstration. Alright, so as discussed, I'll have to first create a component that displays a button for the employee, and then I have to create a service class and inject it into my component. Now this service holds the employee details such as name, employee ID, email ID, etc. So first, let's go ahead and create a component. So here, let me just type ngGC, and the name of the component I'm providing is empinfo.
If getting your learning started is half the battle, what if you could do that for free? Visit SkillUp by Simplilearn. Click on the link in the description to know more.
Alright, so as you can see here in my app folder, I have the component with 4 different files. Alright, so the next thing we have to do is we have to create a service. So to create that, we make use of the command ngGS. You can either give S or service, and the service name I'm providing is records. So let me just say records here. Alright, here you can see 2 files are created. There is a spec.ts file and the .ts file. Alright, so now the service contains all the employee data that needs to be displayed. Right, so let's go ahead and write the data. So first we're going to make use of 3 arrays. I'm going to be displaying employee records for 3 employees. So I'll have to create 3 arrays and provide certain information. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so the array I'm creating is called info1 for the first employee. And I'm going to be passing information like name, employee ID, and the email ID. So the array is of type string, and within which, let me just mention the details. I'm giving random information. I'm just saying Adam Taylor and some random employee ID, and let's say at@abc.net. Alright, so I'm going to be creating 3 records, so I'll just copy the same thing and paste for the rest too. Let's just change here, provide a different name here. And same for the last one. And let me change the name of the array as well. Alright, so with the agenda to retrieve this data in our component, we make use of the method for the same, right? So this method returns the employee data. So let's go ahead and create this method. I'm going to call it getInfo, and then just say string, and then this will just return this.info1. Alright, I'm going to be calling it getInfo1 for better understanding. Same for the rest too as well. I'm just going to return different arrays here. Alright, and lastly info3. Alright. Now, in order to retrieve this information in our component, we need 3 more arrays, right? 3 more arrays that will receive this data. Let's go back to our component.ts file here and then type in the following code. So I've created 3 arrays again. Info received 1, 2, and 3. Now, what we need to do is we have to accept the information that is being sent from the service, correct? Now, as I mentioned, services are implemented with the help of dependency injection. So what we need to do is we'll have to first import the service into the component.ts file. The key reason behind doing this is that when Angular creates this component, an instance of the service class is also made to perform the necessary tasks. Correct? So let's go ahead and just import it here. So I'll say import records service from and let's say records.service. Alright, And what we have to do next is that we must also declare this instance that is being created in the providers array of the component. Alright, so let's just say providers and then say records service. Alright, now we've created the instance of this class, right? However, to access this instance, an object is also created. So this object will in turn access the methods and variables of the service class. So for that, we have to create another object. So let's do that here in our constructor method. Let's say constructor private. And the object I'm creating is called rService. You can give a name of your choice. And then I'm going to just say records service. Alright, now this object will help me retrieve data from the service. So let's go ahead and use this in order to get the employee details. Alright, so I've created 3 different methods here: get info from service class 2, 1 and 3. And these methods will retrieve the data and add it to our array here, that is info received. Alright. And lastly, we'll have to create an unordered list in our HTML file here. We haven't added anything, so let me get rid of this. So now I have to create 3 different buttons for 3 different employees. And when the user clicks on the button, the data is retrieved from the service and then displayed on the UI, right? So as you can see, I've created buttons for 3 different employees, and then I've made use of a Bootstrap class called list group info, and then I've interpolated info which displays the contents of the info variable. Alright, now in order to call the methods in the .ts file, we have to bind them with the button. So since it is bound with the click event, every time you click on the button, the information is displayed. So now the last thing we have to do is we'll have to create a custom HTML tag for the component and then add it to the main component. So let's just do that. Let me copy this here. And then in my app component.html, let me get rid of this. And then let me just create this. I've just created the custom HTML tag for my component. And now just to beautify the code, I'll write a heading. And let's say employee details. And then I'll also add the Simplilearn logo, say image source. I've added the image here, so let me just say logo.png. I've also added some styling to it. Alright. So now let me just save this and have a look at the browser. So here we go. We have the logo here and then employee details heading. And then we have 3 different buttons created, that is employee 1, 2 and 3. And when I click on it, the information of the employee is displayed, the name, the ID and their email address. So yeah, so this is how you can make use of dependency injection and inject a service class into a component. So dependency injection plays a crucial role in Angular. I'm sure you all know that an Angular app is divided into several components. For example, you have the logo component, you have the sign-in component, an image component, and say a create account component. Now these components are standalone, and each of them represents a part of the user interface. Now imagine if all of these components performed common tasks, for example, accessing the database or rendering images on the view, tasks like those. Now instead of having to write the code for every component, you can just make use of Angular services. Now the service can be written once and then injected into all of these components. Now a service could be a function, it could be a variable, or a feature that an application needs. So the main use of a service is to write code once and avoid rewriting of it. Now the same code can be injected into several components that make use of this particular service. But what are Angular services? So normally components are used to ensure a good user experience. Now that is the extent of it. Components make sure that whatever is being rendered onto the screen is right and pristine. But in order to execute tasks, we make use of services, and this approach is ideal. So a component can basically delegate tasks like fetching data from the server, validating user input, or logging directly to the console to a particular service. And these tasks can be made available to any component in the app. So now let's talk about a few features of Angular services. Now typically an Angular service is simply a TypeScript class with an @injectable decorator. This decorator tells Angular that the class is a service and can be injected into components that need that service. Now they can be used to share the same piece of code. They can also inject other services as dependencies. Now these services hold valuable business logic and can also be used to interact with the backend. Now for example, if you want to make AJAX calls, you can have methods to those calls in a service and then use it as a dependency in files. And as mentioned earlier, it can be used to share data among several components. In Angular, services are singleton, meaning that only a single instance of a service gets created and the same instance is used by each and every building block in the application. And finally, a service can be registered as a part of a module, or it can be registered as a part of the component. Now to register it as a part of the component, you'll have to specify it in the providers array of the module. I'm sure you'll understand the concept of services better if we look at a simple demo. So in the next section, we're going to look at a demo, but before that, let me tell you the use case. So basically in the demo, what we'll do is we'll create an employee details list. Say for example, you will have employee information like name, employee ID, and their email ID. We'll create a database of say 3 employees. And on the browser, when you click on the employee button, it displays the information about that particular employee. And at the end, we can also add information to the employee's details. So without delay, let's head to our VS Code and start learning Angular services hands-on. So here, first I've created a folder called demo_Angular, within which I've created a file called hello world. So this was previously used for a tutorial, so the name is just hello world, so don't get confused. However, when you look at the browser, I've written an initial code here, which is Angular services, and I have the Simplilearn logo. So back in my browser, this is what the UI looks like. So to understand the concept of Angular services, first let's go ahead and create a component. So here I'm going to say ng gc einfo. I'm creating a component for employee information. So as you can see, inside my app file, we have the einfo component, which has these 4 files. So if you're wondering what exactly components are and how this is working, then I highly suggest you watch our components video first. So now let's go ahead and create a service. So I'm just typing in the command ng g service. Here G stands for generate, and we're generating a service, and the name of the service that I'm providing is data. So now it creates a service which is going to be a .ts file. So you can observe that .service is appended. This indicates that it is a service. Alright. As mentioned earlier, we have to display the employee details, correct? So for that, in my component.ts file, I'm going to create an array that displays the employee information. In our case, I'm creating 3 different employee records. So for that, I'll have 3 different arrays. So let me just call the arrays info received 1, indicating this is the information of first employee, and this is going to be of type string, and I'll just initialize it to null for now. Alright, and I'm going to create 2 other arrays, and let me just change the name of the arrays. Alright, so now to retrieve the information, I'll have to create a method. Again, I'm creating 3 methods for the 3 different employee records. So I'm going to call the array get info from service 1, indicating it's again for employee 1, and I'm just going to leave it as it is for now. I'll tell you how the information is being received. And I'm going to do the same for the other 2 employee records. So let me just copy paste, and here I'm just going to change the name of the methods. Alright, so this is the initial code for retrieving information. However, we'll have to create the employee record in our service. So back here in my data.ts file, what I'm going to do is I'll create 3 different records for the employees. So let me say info1, which is going to be of type string. Alright, and let me just give random names. Say for example, I say John Matthew. Alright, and employee ID say E354, and let me just give a random email ID and say jm@abc.net. Alright, so I'm going to do the same for the other 2 records. So let me just create another one and call it info2, and the name I'm providing is say Rob Wilson with a different employee ID, say 673, and I'm just going to make it rw@abc.net, and another record for employee number 3, and I'm just gonna say Rose Adams with some employee ID and an email ID. Alright, so now we've created the employee records. So what I have to do is I have to create a method that returns these employee records, correct? So for that, I'm just going to create another method called getInfo1, which is of type string, and it just returns this .info1. Alright, similarly for the rest of the 2 records, I'm just going to retrieve them. Let's say info2 and get info2, and again I'm just going to make it get info3, and this is going to return info3. Alright, so I'm sure you've got an idea as to what I'm doing here. So basically this information is going to be retrieved in our employee component, correct? So for that, I'll have to make use of dependency injection. So here I'll have to import the service that I've created. So let's go ahead and say import. The service was data service. Alright. From /data.service. Alright. Now the main reason we're doing this is to tell Angular that when the component is created, the service instance is also created, and this instance is being used to perform particular tasks. And for that, we'll also have to include this in our providers array. So here, let me just say providers, and let's say data service. Now, to access this instance of service that is created, we make use of a property. So this property basically allows us to access all the methods that are defined in the service class. Alright, so here in my constructor method, I'm just going to say private, and you can give any name for your property, and here I'm just giving the name dService. Alright, and which is of type data service. Alright. So now with the help of this property, I can retrieve information from the service class. So here I'm just going to say this dot info received equals this dot dService dot get info1. Alright. So what it basically does is that it calls the getInfo1 method in our service, which returns the information of the first employee. And this information is being stored in the array that is info received 1. So similarly for the next two methods, I'm just going to use the same piece of code. Let me just change it here. And same for the third one. Alright. So now that we have the logic behind what is being displayed, let's go ahead and create the UI for it. Here in my HTML file, I'm going to create an unordered list. And now I'm going to make use of the ng for directive to basically loop over the record and display everything. So for that, I have to make use of a particular variable. So I'll just say let info of info received. So you can check here in our TS file, the array is info received, correct? So I'm going to make use of the same array here. And since it's displaying the first employee record, I'm just going to say info received 1. Alright, and let me just create a class, a Bootstrap class of list group item, of list group info. And we're just going to have to interpolate info. Alright, that is basically going to display what the information holds, what the info variable holds. Alright, and here as well, let me create a Bootstrap class called list group. Alright, I hope this was clear to you. So basically here, the information is being retrieved with the help of this method, right? That is get info from service 1. So in order to call this method, we'll have to bind it with a button. Alright, so that's what we're going to do. Let's just copy this, and here I'm going to create a button. Alright, and the type is button with name button again. Alright, so I'm going to bind it with the click event. So what happens is that when I click on it, this particular method gets called. Alright, I'm just pasting the method here. And finally, let's just provide the name employee1 for the button. Alright. So similarly, we'll have to do the same for the other two records as well. Let me just make this look better. Alright. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste the same twice. And here I'm going to just change the names. I'll say 2 here. And this is again for employee 2. And I'm going to change this as well. It's going to be it's going to be info received 2. This is going to be info received 3. And finally employee 3. Alright. And lastly, we'll have to include the selector, that is app-e-info, in our main component.html. So here, let me just create a custom tag. Alright, and save this. So now let's go back to our browser and see what it looks like. So here you can see that 3 different buttons have been created for employee 1, 2 and 3. And when you click on it, it retrieves the information, that is the name, the employee ID and their email IDs. So we've successfully created an Angular service and injected it into our component to retrieve information. Alright, so now the last part of the use case that we discussed was to add another detail, that is the employee detail, in the record. Alright, so for that we'll have to take input from the user, and in our case we're taking the location. Now we're also adding the same location for all 3 employees. So this is what services do. They can be used to update, modify, alter anything that happens in the backend. So you can tweak the code a little bit and you can change the entire view of your application. You can add information, you can delete, you can retrieve, you can alter, etc. Alright, so for that, what we're going to do is back in the HTML file, we'll create a form that basically takes the input. So I'm just going to say form, alright, within which I'm going to be defining a div class, within which I'm going to be defining a div tag, inside of which I'll have the input tag of type text, and the name I'm going to be providing it will be location. Alright, and we'll have a value, and I'll just leave it blank, and finally I'll have ng model. So if you're confused as to what I'm doing here, then I suggest you watch the Angular Forms video. It basically teaches you how to work around with Angular Forms. Alright, and now after this we're gonna have a button. So let me say button alright, and I'm gonna just say add info. Okay, alright. So now when I'm creating the form, I'll also have to create a template variable to access all the values within my form. So if I have to access the location, then I'll need a variable to access it. So here let me just go ahead and create a template variable. Let me call it frm, and I'm going to make use of the ng form directive. So this tells Angular that this variable can be used to access all the values within the form. And since I'm using form here, I'll have to import it in my module file. So here I just go ahead and say import forms module from Angular forms, and here in my imports I'll just say forms module. Okay, so I've imported the forms module. So now back in my HTML file, what I'm going to do is that I'll have to make use of this template variable to update my information, correct? So I'll have to create another method that will update information into the records. So here in my component.ts file, I'll have to create another method, and I'm going to call this method update info method. All right. And this basically takes in the template variable, that is form. And let me just specify any. Okay. And what this is going to do is that it updates the record, correct? So I'm going to say this dot dservice dot add info. Now you must be wondering what add info is. I'll just let you know in a minute. And the value that I'm going to be passing will be the value that you've provided as an input, which is nothing but form dot value dot location. All right. So now what happens is that I'll have to again specify what add info is. And this method is going to be defined in the service file, correct? So here I'm going to create another method that's add info. And I'm going to pass info as a parameter. And what this method does is that it just pushes the information or the data into the arrays. So since I'm going to be pushing the same information into all of these arrays, that is info1, info2 and info3, I'm just going to say this dot info1 dot push of info. All right. And the same for the other two arrays as well. Let me just change these. All right. So what exactly I'm doing is that I have a method called add info, which gets information from the component. All right. And it basically pushes this information into the array. And also I'll have to return it. So I'll say return this dot info1. All right. And I'll save it. And here we have another method called update info, which basically calls the add info method in our service and passes the value to it. And in my HTML file, also note that the button type here is submit and not button. So what happens is that now the value that we've received as an input has to be passed on to the method, that is update info. So here I'll say ng submit, and I'm going to call the method update info, and I'm going to pass frm as the argument. And now let's save this and execute. So all right, here you can see that we have an input field and a button saying add info. So now I can just go ahead and say type USA, and when I say add info, and when I check on my employee 1 details, USA has been added to the list, and same goes with employee 2 and employee 3. So I hope this simple demo on Angular services helped you understand the concept better. I highly recommend you play around and explore other possibilities. First, we'll understand what Angular forms are. Then we'll look at the different types of form building supported by Angular. Next up, we'll get acquainted with features like form control and group control. And we'll learn all of this with the help of a simple demo. So without further ado, let's begin. So what exactly are Angular forms? Now I'm sure every application that you use comes with certain amount of form filling, correct? Be it your login credentials or your sign up forms or any sort of registration forms, etc. So forms are an integral part of a web application. You need forms to update your profile or to enter sensitive information, or also to perform any sort of data related tasks. So now let's look at the different types of form building supported by Angular. First up, Angular supports two types of form building. First, you have the template-driven approach, and second, you have the reactive approach. Now let's look at them one by one. So talking about template-driven approach, in this method, the conventional form tag is used to create forms. So Angular automatically interprets and creates a form object with the help of the directives. Now controls can be added to the form using the ng-module tag. Now multiple controls can be grouped using the ng control group module. So it basically uses several module classes to provide controls. Now if you don't get this, don't worry, you'll understand better when I'm showing you the demo. Next up is JSON values. So form value can be generated using the form.value object. Form data is exported as JSON values when the submit method is called. Lastly, basic HTML validations can be used to validate the form fields. In the case of custom validations, directives can be used. So arguably, this method is the simplest way to create an Angular form. So moving on to reactive approach. Now this approach is the programming paradigm revolving around data flows and propagation of change. Now with reactive forms, the component directly manages the data flows between the form controls and the data models. Now reactive forms are code-driven unlike template-driven approach. Reactive forms eliminate the anti-pattern of updating the data model via two-way data binding. So it does not use two-way data binding. And typically a reactive form control creation is synchronous and can be unit tested with synchronous programming techniques. So now let's go ahead and look at form control and form group. So consider a typical form consisting of fields like name, age, and location. Now a form control is basically a class that enables validation of these fields. For each input field, an instance of this class is created. Now these instances help check the values of the field and see if they're either touched, untouched, dirty, pristine, valid, invalid, and so on. So this allows you to check every field for the value. It makes it easier to understand which field's value is invalid or which field has not been entered, etc. Now moving on to form group. So a form group class represents a group of controls. A form can have multiple group controls. The form group returns true if all the controls are valid and provides validation errors if there are any. So I hope this was clear. So moving ahead, let's look at the demo to explain all of these features. I'm sure it will become extremely clear once you look at the demo. So for that, let's head to our VS Code. So back in my VS Code, I've created a component called form component, and I've also included the Simplilearn logo just to beautify the appearance. So once you execute the code, this is what you're going to see on your browser. So you just have the logo at the moment. The first thing we need to do is we'll have to import the forms module. All right. So, but before we begin, let me tell you what the use case is. So we're going to be creating a user registration form, which is going to include 4 fields. That is the first name, last name, email ID, and a password. All right. So now let me show you how to import the forms module. So in your main app.module.ts file, you'll have to import forms module from Angular forms. All right. And then in your imports, you'll have to just call it here. All right. So this is just a simple step. And now once you're done with that, let's go ahead and start our form creation. So here in my component.html, let's enclose the entire form within a div tag. So here, let me say div class is a container within which let me just have one heading which says user registration. Alright, and now let's go ahead and create our form. So first let me just say form. Now I'm going to create a div class for every field. So say div class equals form group. I'll explain it to you a little later. Now first let's create a label. So label tag for, basically it's the first name. So let me just say first name. And the tag will basically have first name again. Alright, and let me just break the line. Next we have the field. So let's say input. Type is text. Name is first name. And we have a class which is the form control class. Alright. So this we'll have to do for all the other fields. So let me just copy this and paste it like 4 times. I'll also add the tag pre for spacing. Let's do that here. And finally, we'll have the button. So let's just add that here with a type submit. And let's just say submit on the button. So now let's go ahead and change these values here. So here let me just change it to last name. Here as well. And here as well. And in this case it is going to be email. So let me just change it here. And finally we have password. So let's add that here. Alright, so let's save this and just have a look at our browser. So there we go. We have our user registration form ready, but I would like to align it to the center. So let me just do that. So here in my CSS file, I'm just going to align all the div tags to the center and the label tag to the left. So let me save this and look at the browser now. And there we go. We have our registration form with a logo. So this is how you create a simple form. Now we'll have to add a directive called ngModel. Now this directive, when added into the input tag, will provide form controls to every input field. Alright, so here let's just go ahead and say ngModel. That is it. So let me just copy this and paste it for every other field. Alright, let me save this. And back in my browser, let me inspect. And here you can see different types of classes like ng-untouched, ng-pristine, ng-valid are added. Right? So this indicates that Angular has recognized the form tag and it has added these classes to the form as well as all the fields. So this is achieved when you add the ng model directive in your input tag. Now, back in my VS Code. Now every form has an output property attached to it called ng submit. Alright, so this property can be bound within a method called the submit method. So once submitted, this method is called, right? So once we click on the submit button, this method has to be called. So to include that, we'll have to just say form ng submit equals submit. Alright, so now we have to define the submit method in our component.ts file. So here, let me just go to our component.ts file and let me just get rid of unnecessary code here. And let's define a function called submit. And then here, let me just console log form submitted. Alright, so let me just get rid of this as well. It's unnecessary here. Let's save this. So what it means is that every time you click on the submit button, this method is called. Alright, so let's just have a look at the browser. So first let's go to our console. And when I click on submit, it says form submitted. Alright, so the next crucial step is to generate JavaScript representation. Now we'll have to make use of another directive called ng form that is assigned to a template variable. Okay, so this JavaScript representation helps with validating all the fields. So I'll help you understand that better. So back in our HTML file, let's just create a variable first. Let's call it login. Alright, and say ng form. Okay, now the ng form object includes the JavaScript representation. So now while you're calling the submit method, you're going to pass login as a parameter. So let's just say login here. And in my TS file, again, let's just say login. And along with it, I want login to be displayed. So I say login again. So now let's save this. And if you have a look at the browser, let's click on submit. And now here you can see the JavaScript representation. So within form, I can check for email or say first name. And here for this field first name, you can see different properties attached. You can see invalid. Is it invalid or is it untouched, which is true, or are there any errors? So this basically gives you all information about the particular field. So we can make use of this feature to validate the information. So we're going to learn about that in our next segment. Moving on to form validation, one way to ensure that incorrect fields are not submitted is by disabling the submit button. Correct? Now apart from this, you can also specify certain properties in your input tag for the corresponding input field. Now, let's say that the fields can't be empty and the form only accepts names with the minimum length of 2 and the maximum length of 7. Alright, so here in my input tag, I just mention required, meaning this field cannot be empty, and min length to 2 and max length to say 7. Alright. So to check this, let's go to our browser and here let me submit the form without filling the first name, and evidently there has to be an error. So when I submit it and I look here within forms and here controls, and my first name, you can see that an error is shown. Here it says required equals true. That means there is one error. Now you can make use of these form control objects. You can leverage form control objects to ensure field validation and display a message whenever an error occurs. Right? So to do that, you need to access these objects like errors or invalid or touched. All of these properties or objects need to be accessed. For that, we'll have to create a template variable. And then this variable is assigned to this object. So back in our VS Code, let's create a variable. Let me call it name. And let's say ng model. Alright, here the variable name receives the control object. So here back in my browser, when I submit again without the first name, you can see that the invalid property is set to true. Correct? So this helps us use this property to alert the user with the help of a simple if logic. So back in my VS Code, let me create another div tag within which I mention ng if, within which I'm going to use a simple if logic. So let's say ng if name, which is our template variable, name dot touched and name dot invalid is true, right? Then I'm going to alert. So I'm going to make use of an alert here. Let's say alert danger. Alright. So in my CSS file, I'll have to mention the simple styling for alert. So here, let me just say, so we're going to have the background color red for danger, alright? And here, I'm going to display the message invalid in bold. So now, let's go back to our browser and check it. So let me proceed without entering the last name. It says invalid here. So this was a simple demonstration to show you form validation. Of course, you can modify the code depending on your requirement. Say suppose the length of the first name is too short, then you can alert the user with a different message. Or suppose they have missed out on filling a form field, then you can again alert the user. So you can basically make use of the nested if condition, right? Now just to help you understand that better, let me just show it to you. Now back in my HTML file, instead of invalid, let me have another tag, a paragraph tag, within which I make use of ng if again. Now ng if name dot errors dot required is true. Then I display the message first name required. Alright. And if the length of the first name is not 2, now if the length of the first name is less than 2, then I'm going to display another message. So let me just say name dot errors dot min length. If this is true, then I'm going to say sorry, short first name. Alright, so let's save this and have a look at the browser. When I proceed without providing the name, it says first name required. But when I type in one character, it says sorry, short first name. But if I type in another character, it accepts. So I hope this made you understand how form validation works. So this was just a simple demonstration again. Now I highly recommend you explore these properties and play around with these objects. Trust me, it's really fun. So I hope this tutorial helped you out. Let's understand what exactly is Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a powerful toolkit basically a collection of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript tools for creating and building responsive web applications and pages. It is a free and open source project based on GitHub and originally created by Twitter. Now, to put it more easily, Bootstrap is a giant collection of handy, reusable bits of code written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's also a front-end development framework that enables developers and beginners to design quick and responsive websites. Now, there are several advantages to using Bootstrap. To name a few, Bootstrap comes with a responsive grid. You don't have to spend time working on your layouts. Bootstrap comes with its own code for automatically resizing images based on the current screen size. It also comes with different components that you can use for your web page. These components could be navigation bars, drop-downs, progress bars, thumbnails, etc. It also offers excellent documentation and is customizable. So Bootstrap comes in extremely handy to create responsive user interface. So now, before using Bootstrap, it needs to be embedded into your application. So let's see how to embed Bootstrap into Angular. Now there are two ways to do it. First up is by using the Bootstrap CDN or the Content Delivery Network. Now this enables users to load CSS, JavaScript, and images remotely from its servers. The other method is to use Bootstrap NPM. Bootstrap, jQuery, and other packages and frameworks can be installed via the command prompt. In the tutorial that I'm going to be showing you, I've embedded Bootstrap using NPM. Alright, so I'm sure you'll only understand the concept better when you look at a demo. So let's go ahead and create an application with the help of Angular Bootstrap. So in this tutorial, what I'm going to be showing is the creation of a blog post. So let me show you what we're going to be doing. So here I've created a simple blog for Simplilearn and I've added the Simplilearn logo. I've also written a few lines about Simplilearn and what they offer. I've also mentioned their tagline, and when you scroll down, you can see that I've mentioned the different courses they're offering. And when you click on the More Info button, it navigates to the official page that gives you the overview for that particular course. So this is for Lean Six Sigma, the same for full stack web development as well. And the same for the last one, that is cybersecurity. And finally, I've added a simple video here to just make it more beautiful. So I've added a simple video. And lastly, I've also linked our YouTube channel. So when you click on the YouTube icon, it will navigate to the YouTube channel, to our YouTube channel here. Alright, so this is what we're going to be creating using Angular Bootstrap. So I'm hoping you're all ready for it. So without further delay, let's jump in. So first, let's find the template that we want to use for our blog. So for that, I'm going to just go ahead and say Bootstrap blog template. And I'm just going to click on the first link that I get. And here you can choose the template that you like. So I'm just going to look for more templates here. And the one that we are going to choose is, this one. So which is small businesses. So you can go ahead and click on that. You can then click on live preview. And once you do that, you can just say view frame source. So here you can see that the HTML code is available. It has the head section and then the body section. So the head section consists of a lot of meta tags, and then you have the title, and then you also have the CSS file references. And then if you look at the body tag, you have different code for different parts of the UI. There's code for navigation bar, and then you have page content code, heading row, call to action, and all of that. And lastly, you have the footer. So what we're going to be doing is that we'll take all of the code, and then we'll have to create components for each of it, and then we'll include all the components in our main HTML file. So that is the best practice that Angular uses. So we're going to make use of components. And you can also see that when you scroll down, you can see that it has certain dependencies. So here it has the Bootstrap dependency, and then you have jQuery. So we'll have to download them. So we'll have to install them. And as mentioned earlier, we're going to be installing them with the help of npm. So for that, we'll have to head back to our VS Code. Here, back in my VS Code, I've created a folder called Angular Demo. And then I've also created a file called Demo Components. And here, I'm just going to say cd demo components, within which I'll say npm install jQuery. So this could take a while. And once you've installed jQuery, go ahead and type npm install Bootstrap. Alright, so we've successfully installed jQuery and Bootstrap. So now we need to add the references to these JavaScript files. To do that, go to your angular.json file. And here we'll have to add them in our build section. So here you can see we have styles and scripts. So in our scripts array, we define the relative path to these JavaScript files. So these files are generally stored in your node modules. So go ahead and here you can look for Bootstrap. Here you go. And then in your dist file, and then click on JS. And then you can see you have bootstrap.min.js. Well, I'm sorry, we need bootstrap.bundle.min.js. So here you can just right click and say copy relative path. And back in my JSON file, in my scripts, I'm gonna just paste it here. And make sure to make it a path by providing // Alright, and then the next thing we need is the jQuery.min.js file. So for that, again, in our node modules, you'll have to look for jQuery. So here there's jQuery, and then click on dist, and then we have jQuery.min.js. So again, let me just copy the path and paste it here. Follow the same procedure for this as well. Alright, so we've embedded both our files in our angular.json file. So now in our code here, in the beginning, they've also included the CSS file. So we'll have to embed that as well. So here back in Bootstrap, let me just add the CSS file as well. That's bootstrap.min.css. I'm just going to copy the relative path and just provide it here. Let me just change these to /. Okay, so we have our custom style sheet. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this and just paste it in our, and then you can just paste it here. All right. So I think we've added all the dependencies and the custom style sheet and everything. So now let me just close all of these files. What we can do now is that we can go ahead and take the code from the source here. So I'm just going to copy the body tag. Alright, so I'm going to copy this till the footer, and then I'm just going to paste it in my component.html file. So as mentioned earlier, I will create components and then place the code for specific parts of the UI in these components. So let me just see if I've got everything here. Okay. So I'll be creating 4 components. The first one will be for the navigation bar. The second will be for the introduction. And then the third one will be to display the courses that we're providing. And then lastly, we'll have the footer component, right? So first, let's create these components. I've also created a components folder here in my app folder. So I just have to type in the command nggc. First, we'll create the component for the top navigation bar. So I'm just saying nggc. So I'm just going to say components /navbar. Alright, so the component has been created. So what I'm going to do is I'll just copy this and paste it here. Alright, and the next component I'm going to be creating is for the introduction, right? So I'll say nggc components /intro. Alright, so I will have to take this code here. I'm also going to be including the call to action part. So I'll just copy paste this one in my intro.html file. So let me do that. And then I'm going to have the main course content component. So for that, I'll say nggc components /courses. And we're going to copy the next part of the code. Alright, until till the footer. Let me just add it here. And finally, we're going to create the component for the footer. So I'll say nggc components /footer. And the last part of the code, I'm just going to add it there. All right. So now we'll have to create the custom HTML tags for these components and then place it in our HTML file, right? So first one that we created was the navigation bar. So here, head over to the TS file, just copy the selector, and then here, and then in our app.component, let me just create the tags. Similarly for intro, just going to copy the selector. And then for courses, so we have app-courses, that as well. And then lastly, we have the footer component. So let me just copy that. Paste it here. Alright, so we've included all the components. So let's just run this application and see if everything is displayed intact. So here, let me just say ng serve. So when you execute the command, you can see that the template is being displayed. So you have the navigation bar, you have the intro component, and then we have the courses component, and finally we have the footer component, right? Okay, so now that we have the template ready, we can go ahead and customize it according to our needs. So now I'm going to be making a few changes to the code. We're going to add the Simplilearn logo. We're going to change the tagline here. We're going to display something else over here. Alright, so let's go back to our VS Code to customize and display the final output. So here, the first thing that I'm going to be doing is changing the message here. I'm going to display Simplilearn. For that, in our navbar component, let's go to the HTML code. And here, instead of start Bootstrap, let me just type in Simplilearn. Alright, so when you save it and when you look at the browser, you can see that Simplilearn is displayed. And the next thing that I want to do is I want to add the image, right? A Simplilearn logo. So what I've done here is I've already added the logo .png file in my assets folder. So I'll just go ahead and provide the path to this. So that's going to be in our intro file. So here, image source is going to be assets / logo.png. So let me save this. So there we go, the logo is displayed. So the next thing is we'll have to change this part of the UI. So the information that I want to display is this. I'm going to be displaying world's #1 online bootcamp and other information. So what I'm going to do is back in my VS Code, I'm just going to delete this. And instead of that, I'm just going to copy this. That's world's #1 online bootcamp. And then within the paragraph tag, I'll display something else. So let me get rid of this. Let me just copy the information that I want to display. Paste it here. And let me just give a line break. Let me save this and see if it's displayed. So yeah, we can see that the information is being displayed. Next up here, instead of displaying call to action message, I'm going to display a explore programs message. So let's go back to our VS Code. Let me just say explore programs here. And then lastly, instead of this message here, I want to display the message get certified, get ahead with our programs. So back in our VS Code, I'm just going to get rid of this. And paste this instead. So when you have a look at the browser, let me refresh this. You can see it displays the message get certified, get ahead, and all of that. Well, now what I'm going to do is I'm really not happy with the font size and everything. So I'm just go ahead and add certain styling. You can customize this and provide your own font size and all of that. So here I'm just going to mention style. And then say font size, and I'm going to make it XX large. Alright, so let's see Yeah. All right. So the font size has increased. So I think I'm happy with this. All right. So the next thing we have to do is add information here for our courses. So back in our VS Code, we'll have to go to the courses component. So here I'm going to just type in the code for the different courses. So I already have it here. So the first thing is this message that I want to display. Let me just copy that. And for our first tag, I'm just going to say postgraduate program in Lean Six Sigma. And the next information I'm going to be providing is the duration. So here, let me just get rid of this. Paste that here. Let me just break the line to beautify the code. And here for our reference link, I already have the link here. So I'm just going to paste that. So once you click on the more info button, it will automatically navigate to this page. All right. So let me save this. Next up, I'm going to do the same for the other two courses as well. So it says postgraduate program in full stack development. And then we're going to mention the duration and the cohort. So let me paste that. I'll also provide a line break. And then link, I have it here. So I'm just going to paste that. And finally, for the third card, I have the third link here. Let me get rid of this extra code and paste this instead. And then let's also provide the link for the same. All right. So let me save this and have a look at the browser. So you can see that the information has been added. You can see it displays postgraduate program in Lean Six Sigma, full stack development, and cybersecurity. So once I click on more info, it leads you to that page that shows the overview. All right. So now the next thing on the agenda was to display a short video and then the link to our YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and add that in our courses component. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get the code to add a video from Google, and then I'm going to provide the source, which is going to be the video that I would want to display. So I've received the code. I'm just going to paste it here. So you can get the code on Google. So go ahead and just paste that. Also for the source, I have a video in my assets folder, which I have provided here. So when I save it and look at the browser, here we go. You can see the video here. All right. And once clicked, it starts playing. All right. And lastly, we'll have to provide the logo for YouTube and then the link to navigate to the YouTube page. So let's go ahead and do that. So here again, I've pasted the code for the YouTube logo. So here you can see that I've added the image that is youtube.png in my assets folder, and I've provided the source. And accordingly, I've also added the styling. I've provided a white background and I've also aligned the text to the center of the page. All right. And I've also displayed the message saying, check out our YouTube channel for technical videos and tutorials. And then I provided the link to our channel on YouTube. So let me just save this and head back to the browser. And here you can see that we have the YouTube logo and we have the message displayed. So once you click on the logo, it navigates to the Simplilearn channel on YouTube. Alright, so if you want, you can also change the message here for the footer. So here in footer.html, I can just remove this and paste this. I say Simplilearn Solutions and all rights reserved. When I save it and look at the browser, it must get updated. So yeah, there we go. So with the help of Bootstrap, we have successfully created a website which is basically a blog. And we've also added the reference links and images and logos to customize it according to our requirements. So yeah, this is it. This is how you make use of Bootstrap and embed it into your Angular for more responsive and better user interface. Let's have a look at the basics of routing. Now I'm sure that you've observed that the URL changes every time you click on a particular link or on an icon on the user interface. Correct? Now this basically indicates that you are navigating throughout the application. Now to achieve this navigation, we use a mechanism called routing. Routing is essentially used to navigate through a website or a web application. But how is it achieved in Angular? Especially in Angular, routing plays a major role. It is used to create single-page applications. Now these applications are loaded just once and new content is added dynamically. Applications like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Gmail are a few examples of single-page applications. The best part of using single-page applications is that it provides an excellent user experience and you don't even have to wait for new pages to load, which by extension makes single-page applications extremely fast. But how is this new content loaded? Enter routing. Now, routing is the mechanism that, as discussed earlier, that is used to navigate through the application and load new content. Routing helps Angular configure the route and the component that needs to be displayed. Now, I'm sure you're going to understand the concept of routing better when you work on it hands-on. So in the demo, we're going to be navigating to the login and the home pages of a web application with the help of routing. So let's head to our Visual Studio Code. So basically, the objective of our application is to navigate to home and the login pages. So when I click on the login icon here, it loads the login page. And here you can see the extension /login. And similarly, with home, once you click on it, some new information gets added and the URL changes with a /home appended. Alright, so this is the main objective of our application. So to create it, let's head back to our VS Code. Alright, so here I've created a folder called demo_angular and I've created a file called demo routing. Now the first thing you want to do is open the index.html file and make sure that the base tag is added. Now although this is generally added when your app is created, if it is not, then add a base tag with href attribute which is set to a /. Alright, now this is generally done to tell Angular to construct the URL while navigating with a /. Alright, and the next thing you want to do is open your app.module.ts file and check if the app routing module has been imported. If not, go ahead and import it and then also mention it in your imports array. With that, the initial setup is done. Now to create the nav bar, the code that I'm going to be using is already explained in the previous video, that is Angular Bootstrap. I highly suggest you go through that video before watching this. So the code is already available. I'm just going to create a component and write the code for it and paste the code in it. So let's do that. Let me say nggc navbar. Alright, so this component is now created. Now here in my HTML file, I'll just get rid of this and paste the code for the navbar. So here we go. I've pasted the code for the navigation bar. And back in my app.component.html file, I'll just remove all the unwanted code here and just specify the custom HTML tag for my navbar. So let me just create one here. Alright, let me save this. Let me just run the application and see if it's displaying correctly. Alright, so when I open the browser, the navigation bar has been created along with these different options, that's home, about, services, and login. Alright, and we also have the Simplilearn icon here. Alright, now the next step is to generate the components to display the login page content and the home page content. Now again, I have used Bootstrap to define the user interface for these files. You can easily find the code online. Just search for Bootstrap login templates, and depending on your requirements, you can choose the appropriate one. So first, let's create the components for my two files, that is for the home component and the login component. So let's go ahead and do that. NGGC, I'm just going to call it login for my login component. Alright, and then I'm going to say NGGC home for the home component. Alright, so I'm just going to copy the code for the login component. So back in my login.html file, I'll just paste the code here. Okay. Also note that I've added the Simplilearn logo in my assets folder and then just provided the source for it here in my login component. Alright. So next up is the home component. And if you've seen the previous video, that is Angular Bootstrap, you might have seen that we created 3 different components, that is intro, courses, and footer, which included the content for the intro message, for the courses, and the footer message. Correct? So here we're going to just paste the code for all of these 3 and then just display it when the home button is clicked. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'll just paste it here. So this basically has all the content. One thing I want to tell you is that in the previous video, we made sure that the code was written in 3 different components. However, for this, I've just added all the code in the same component. Now, I agree that this is not the best practice. So if you want, you can go ahead and create 3 different components and separate the code into these 3 components and just add the custom HTML tags in your home component. I'm just hoping you're following me right now. And also here in my assets folder, I've added a video and the YouTube logo that needs to be displayed when the home icon is clicked. Alright, so now that we've created the home and the login components, the next step is to configure the routes for the application. Alright, so here you can see that we have a file called app_routing_module.ts file. So here we have the routes and the router module that is imported, and we also have a constant called routes, which is strongly typed to routes from the router package. Alright, now this array is used to define all the possible routes in the application. Now each route is basically an object with a path. So here in my routes array, I'm just going to go ahead and create the paths. That is, we have 2 different routes, right? One is for login and one is for home. So I'm just going to create a path object. So let's say path. Within curly braces, I say path. And then the path that I'm going to give is login. This is basically what will appear on the URL. Alright. And the component that needs to be navigated to is nothing but the login component. So let me just say login component. As you can see, the login component has been automatically imported. Now same with the home path. So let me just say path home, and the component that needs to be rendered is the home component. Alright. Now the next step is to link these routes to a button in the nav bar, that is the home and the login button, right? So we're going to make use of the nav tag and an anchor tag for this. You can see that we have a nav tag and an anchor tag which encloses the login and the home components. Alright. Now we're going to make use of two directives from the router package called router link and router link active. Now these are specified within the anchor tag. The router link basically holds the path to the page, and the latter, that is the router link active, specifies one or more CSS classes that will be applied when the router link is active. Alright, so to do that, let me just add router link. Alright, in our case it is home here, and we're going to have another directive called router link active, and we're just going to say active here. Alright, same for the login icon here. Let me just copy this, and instead of home, the path we created for this was login. Alright, so this is how you can bind the route to your specific button on your UI. Now, despite of all this, how are we specifying where these components are to be displayed? Right? The answer to this is using the router outlet directive. Now again, this directive is available in the router package. So we have to add that in our app component.html file. So here, just go ahead and type router outlet. Alright, so with that, we've created a simple navigation bar which has different options, that is home, about, services, and link. And once the user clicks on the home icon, it displays the content that is in the home component.html file. And once the user clicks on the login component, it displays the content in the login.html file. Alright, it's as simple as that. So now let's go to the browser and see if it executes correctly. So alright, we have the navigation bar, and once I click on the home icon here, alright, yes, we see that all the content has been loaded. You can see we have the intro section, we have the courses section, and the footer section as discussed. And the most important part is that here in our URL, you can see that /home has been appended. This shows that a route has been created that navigates to the home component. So we've successfully created a route here. And for login component, when I click on this icon, you can see that the path changes here and the login component gets displayed. Alright, so this is how routing is achieved in Angular. And with that, we come to the end of this session. If you have any doubts or queries regarding this topic, let us know in the comment section. So thank you so much for being here, and watch out for more videos on the Angular series. Until then, keep learning and stay tuned to Simplilearn.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.